coming back to Meeke, and today we are talking about this brat ban that is sweeping the nation. Kids not welcomed in restaurants, kids being requested to fly at the back of airplanes and not welcomed on vacation resorts. And so we're talking about that and seeing that kind of reflected in the culture. But what happens when that type of mentality starts to creep into the church? Have we seen that happening? Have we seen churches take a different approach to children? Maybe there was a time where kids were welcomed into the main sanctuary, or as we call it now, big church, and now they have their own little smaller churches that they're invited to fellowship in. Let's talk about that and get some perspective on that. Pastor John Snyder here in studio with me. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Now, you pastor at Christ Church in New Albany, Mississippi, and you've been the pastor there 12 years, but you've been a pastor, been in the ministry 15 years.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your church and your philosophy, maybe your approach to children.
Well, we'd be a fairly traditional church to many people, and while we, in our traditional approach, we tend to try to keep everything centered around the person of Christ, and so this has guided other decisions as well. So with regard to children, we would lean more toward the side of a church that involves children with adults as often as possible. If children are able to be in a service without being particularly disruptive, so at Christ Church New Albany, that tends to be about age 4 and up. We provide a nursery for those that want them. Others don't want a nursery for their children, and they want to integrate the children into the service, and they're allowed that freedom. We also have a Sunday school that is age-based if the parent wants to avail themselves of that. If they don't, then the children are allowed to come with the parents into whatever classes they're in. So it's kind of a hybrid, more toward the side of an integrated church, but not really a full-blooded approach to that.
Now, how do you mention, if the kids are not too much of a distraction? Because I think on the other side, that's what pastors would say, that the kids are a distraction. The parents need to receive from the Lord. When they come on a Sunday morning or, Sunday afternoon, whenever, they need to be able to receive from the Lord. And if you've got, say a baby crying or a kid that, is fidgety, at what point do you decide this is a distraction?
Well, I don't know any church that doesn't have that situation. Even if you don't have children, we have distractions. So I think that generally the parent will understand that a certain amount of crying of a baby is okay, but then it reaches a place where folks are bothered. I'm easily distracted in preaching, so I try not to look at them. So I don't want them to be embarrassed, but in our setting, when it reaches a certain place where folks are kind of noticing it, they just quietly step out the back. If it were a really extreme case, then the way we would respond to it would just be to sit down with the parents and ask them in the future, could they maybe take the children out. Then you do have the other situation that you mentioned where if a family is a large family, so there are a lot of little children in the family, mom can often miss, if she doesn't want to put the child in the nursery and the child's noisy, then she leaves the service. She can often miss years of corporate worship, and so we do provide or attempt to provide a cry room where they can still be a part of the service, but not feel like they're a distraction.
Now, okay, Pastor John, you are familiar with the story of the restaurant banning kids.
Right.
I'm sure you've heard of other instances where kids are not allowed. Certainly, you can see the shift in the culture, our church culture or our theological convictions. You can see some change happening there. Is there an issue behind this that we're missing? Is it just about the children? Is it just about providing for them a comfortable setting, a comfortable backdrop where, they are ministered to as well, but the parents who we're really sent to minister to, I think sometimes we think, right? But they are getting what they've come for. Is there a different issue that maybe we're overlooking?
Yeah, I think so. And using the restaurant as an example, it's really helpful because I think that if we're not careful, we do approach the entire church scene from a marketing perspective. And so we might have the same fundamental values as the restaurant owner, which for good or bad, we say, well, children may distract adults, and so it's actually more spiritually beneficial, and we tend to think about it in that way, what's going to be of immediate benefit. But I think that if we back up from the issue, there's so many secondary questions attached to family, children, worship, evangelism, Sundays, how do we orchestrate it, worship styles. There's so many secondary issues. I think that it's really helpful if we back up and we deal with the primary. And the primary, I think there's a few. I think the bigger question, if we back up, it's not children, and it's not parents, and it's not effectiveness. But the bigger question is God himself. And there are two fundamental responses, two fundamental approaches in church that we can have. We can either be people who allow God to initiate our decisions, or we can become the strategizers. And so if God is the initiator, then the whole question becomes, how does God want us to steward the souls of children? And how does God want us to steward the souls of adults? If we are strategizers, then like the restaurant owner, we look at the setting and we say, what's going to be of most immediate benefit? And so pragmatism becomes the dominant force. And the problem with pragmatism, other than the fact that God is not the initiator, is that pragmatism is so short-sighted. We try a new thing. We say, well, if I'm the strategizer, we tend also to be reactionary. So we look at the setting. And so 10 years ago, people look at a setting and we say, we've got children dropping out of church. They're not interested because the preacher's preaching. He's using King James language. The songs are long. The prayers are long. The kids are checked out. How can we reach children? And so the tyranny of the urgent drives our question. So then we say, well, what we need then is we need a child-oriented service. And so we divide the family. But the problem with pragmatism is that the immediate effect is all we see. And we don't know if 20 years down the line, will we look back and say that the children that we raised in their isolated environment, we've postponed adolescence to age 22, and when we bring them into an adult service, they're completely unaware of how to respond to God with other adults.
Wow.
So that's the problem with pragmatism. The other problem is that when we're the strategizers, we always tend, as fallen humans, to be reactionary. So we look at a problem. Perhaps we look at a church that doesn't let children in at all, that fragments children from parents, and we have families that are never together. They're not together during the week. They're not together on Sunday. The children go to their rock band group. The parents go to their old school group, and it seems like they never meet. And so we react to that problem, and we say, well, obviously the answer is to go as far from the problem as possible. So if a fragmented family is our problem, then an integrated church is the only solution. But again, like pragmatism, in 10 years we look back and we say, did sitting my children beside me in every service really do the spiritual thing that I hoped it would do? Or did it just kind of bring them together socially with the adults?
And so how do we know the answer to that question? And here's something else I want to back up, because I don't know if it's just by order that you started with our ingenuity and us strategizing and removing kids from church, or if you feel like that decision to do that is not necessarily a God-following decision. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Well, I think that the big picture, the strategist versus the one who responds to God's initiative I think that is a serious issue. And I think that the strategist approach is a slippery slope, not endorsed by Christ. If we look at the pattern of Christ in the Gospels, you constantly find the Father initiating, the Son responding. So I think that that is the only safe pattern for us as parents or as believers, or particularly as church leaders. But I don't think that the question of integrated church versus isolated age-based programs, I don't think that that's as significant as of an issue. I don't think that that's black and white. I wouldn't want to look at a church that does things differently and they have a youth group and say to them, well, you're sinning because you have a youth group. And I wouldn't want to look at a church that has children sitting by the parents at every possible moment and say to them, you're righteous because you have your children with you at all moments. I mean, as parents, we make great parents, but we make terrible redeemers. I mean, we cannot give our children new hearts by keeping them beside us. So I think that the cure to that dilemma is to follow the pattern of Christ. And that does contain a few things. The first is that we gather together in the short few hours we have together each week as believers. We're gathered together really to view the greatness of God in such a way that we become self-forgetful. So we become preoccupied with someone other than us. If that's our approach, then children's church becomes very difficult to orchestrate in that way, because immediately by isolating the child and gearing everything to them. So there's a lot of entertainment, there's a lot of games, all right, as well as communicating to them on their level, which is wonderful. So immediately the child has the understanding that God is really very me-centered. He's about me. I'm 5 years old, so God, dresses like a clown for me. And when I'm 20 years old, God will be different then. But God ultimately is about us. And the parents feel the same way. God is about us. I prefer to have talks on this topic. I prefer to have my environment in this way. And so because I prefer that, God must prefer it. And we have a very egocentric approach.
I think that you're already going here. So let me just highlight this, because I think you're already going here. You're discussing the dangers of maybe what our philosophies are. When we have this, and because I think somebody might be watching right now, and somebody might say, well, the Lord led me to separate kids from big church, and so they would say that was a God-initiated decision. They wouldn't say that we were strategizing or trying to make a sound business plan. And so what would you say to that? And then what would you say are some of the dangers when we hold so firmly to our philosophies on kids on both sides of the spectrum?
Well, I think that if we follow the pattern of Christ, then we do not have to believe everything everybody says. And so if a person tells me, God told me, and God led our church to do this, I wouldn't want to call them a liar, but I would like for there to be some evidence. And if another person says, well, God led us in a very different way. Now, I don't doubt that God leads us to apply the gospel in different ways in the secondary issues, in different cultures, in different times. We don't want to have a cookie-cutter idea of Christianity. But we do need to give some proof. One of the proofs of following God would be this Christ-centeredness, but not only Christ-centeredness in our focus, but in our pattern. God has given us children. We don't teach our children at home in this way. We don't give them a book on what it is to cook a meal. Okay, so you have children, and I've met your daughter, and your daughter walks into the kitchen, and you're cooking at night. So she learns by observation. She has questions, and so you talk to her. And when you talk to her, you don't talk to her on a collegiate level. You talk to her on her level. So those things are obvious. Children learn by observation. Children learn by us speaking to them on their level. But when we deal with children, I think it is spiritually in particular, participation at the younger ages is less. Observation is more. And that shifts as we grow until when we're an adult, observation is there as well, but participation is much higher. So for instance, let's talk about children in prayer. How does a child learn how to pray? Well, you could do a little study in children's church and say, children, this is what prayer is. Now let's pray. We're going to pray around in a circle. And so they begin to pray. But we've all done this before. And Joey prays for his dog, and Susie prays for her grandmother. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's really inadequate compared to the other option. The other option is that you bring children who can sit still enough, bring them in with the adults. So in our church service, the first service on Sunday morning is an hour-long prayer meeting. Then we have the hour-long preaching normal worship service. And the children, 4 and up, or sometimes younger if the parents want to, are brought in the prayer meeting. And adults will say to us who visit the church, why do you bring children into a prayer meeting? You don't expect a 5-year-old to pray, do you? Well, no, not really, not on that level. We bring children in for observation. How does a child know how an adult seeks the face of God on behalf of a lost friend if they never see their parents cry out to the Lord on behalf of a lost friend? Yeah. Many times in our prayer meeting, this has happened. Parents that have 3 or 4 children, all right, and they have an older child, a teenager who's breaking their heart. So in the prayer meeting, they'll just very kindly, humbly, but sometimes shockingly, they stand up and they say, God, you're our only hope for our children. Lord, you know that my children's hearts, they are not following you. And we'll have a parent break down, weep, and plead with God for the soul of their child. You can never teach a kid that in a book. They'll never forget. Right. That's how adults seek the Lord. At other times, we have tragedies in the church, and we say, well, what do? There's a sin in the church that's broken our hearts. And the next prayer meeting, the adults cry out to the Lord. So in that way, they observe and they learn something that they can never get through a sermon.
And we don't have to feel the pressure of explaining everything and trying to make it easily understood
Right,
by
right.
that
And
kid.
in many ways, you know, we teach them, it's like teaching in the ABCs. They don't yet understand how that's going to come together in words and paragraphs. But we're giving them building blocks that one day it'll be the fuel that will be ignited when they say, oh, now I understand.
Well, we got to wrap up. We've run out of time in this segment. Got to take a quick break. Such a rich conversation. Thank you so much, Pastor John. I still have more questions. I'm sure you have more answers. Stick around. Meeke will return. We're going to have Buddy Smith, Executive Vice President of American Family Association, in studio to talk about this topic and how it's affecting the culture. Don't go anywhere.